they push out their quite male personality traits in that way. I think that's what we're seeing in DEI, and I think it's quite attractive to those kind of gay men because it does have a lot of soft power to it. You only need one or two people in an organisation to turn it, as it were, onto some quite extreme pathways. These men have come in and they're quite forthright, and they don't tolerate or brook any kind of dissent. You know, so somebody raises a question, it's like, what are you talking about, you bigot?
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Okay, hi everybody. I'm here today with the writer Gareth Roberts, who contributes regularly to The Spectator, Unheard and Spiked, having previously written for TV shows, including Coronation Street, Emmerdale and Doctor Who. He's also the author of Gay Shame, which charts the societal evolution and integration of gay men in the UK across the last 2 decades. A particular area of interest is the issue that he calls genderism, and how views about gender identity versus biological sex are splitting the so-called LGBT community, if indeed such a thing even exists, which we'll talk about. Did I get that right, Gareth? Thank you for
Yes, you
joining us.
did. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to be here today because I think one of the areas that I didn't quite cover enough maybe in the book is how this stuff appears in the workplace and where it comes into DEI issues and compliance and all those kind of things. So this is quite an interesting area.
Oh, fantastic! So this is a world first, exclusive. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I thought this probably would be the first interview you've done with a focus on the workplace. I just want to explain to viewers kind of where I'm going with this, I guess, because it might seem a little bit of a sort of strange crossover. I think it's fascinating. So I think basically women who are indeed overrepresented within DEI and HR are getting an awful lot of the blame for much of what has gone wrong within these fields at the moment. And I do totally accept that there are big questions to answer about women's behaviour and their role within some of these things. So, I definitely want to explore in other episodes things like toxic empathy, safetyism, the sort of language policing, behaviour policing. I think that's all fascinating stuff. But what I think is rarely, if ever, discussed is the part that's played by men working in and around DEI. Now, there are fewer of them, but I've noticed that they often seem to have an outsized influence. So they're quite often the head of DEI or the head of culture, it might be called, or they're in a senior leadership role, or they're well-known kind of consultants or influencers. They quite often have really big personalities, very strong opinions, and a very loud voice. Something that's become increasingly noticeable to me is that women who work in and around HR and DEI are starting to talk about this. And I've had people coming to me kind of quietly telling me that kind of the men have taken over DEI and are dominating conversations and even bullying people sometimes, including women. So they're creating an atmosphere that is supposed to be inclusive, but actually where dissent is clearly unwelcome and challenges will be sort of shamed or shouted down. And so people are starting to ask questions about the business impact of a culture that's starting to feel distinctly unhealthy. And I think there are some implications to that I think that good organisations, the smartest organisations, should really be thinking about. Now, there aren't many straight men in DEI roles. It's just is a thing. And I've invited you here today to help me explore what might be going on and where to go from here, because you're so good on the sort of psychology of men. So my idea was to pool our expertise and highlight the places where organisations should be alive to potential problems, risks, waste as well. I think there's questions about where budgets are going. And, if people listening are starting to recognise any of these kind of unhealthy dynamics which are developing in their own workplace. So I guess to any HR professionals listening, it's worth considering what impact men like this are having on your organisation. I think it's probably quite often an unseen impact, unmeasured. But I think it's creating potentially risk for organisations by fostering this environment that could be seen as hostile to certain groups or people with certain protected beliefs. So thinking about, for example, if a case relating to sex discrimination went to an employment tribunal, could the words and actions of this person or some trainers they've had in contribute to an overall picture of a workplace that was hostile to women? That's gonna come back to bite you in an employment tribunal. Also, I'm thinking about the impact on retention. There are an awful lot of particularly middle-aged women talking about this and just saying, I've really had enough of this. I don't want to work for this organisation anymore. I've raised concerns about this and I've been shouted down. So I've got questions about whether women are potentially leaving roles because of some of these guys. And then I think there's also questions about your employer brand. If you're seen as being not particularly friendly to women, or word gets around that you're not a nice place for women to work, that's going to have a damaging impact on the talent that you can attract in future. You don't really want people talking about your organisation like that. So that's the kind of overall picture. I mean, we can get into some more of the detail and some examples and things, which I've collected. I guess my first question for you, Gareth, is, we've talked briefly before, and I wondered if in the time since we last spoke, you've had any sort of theories about why gay men particularly might be overrepresented in DEI, which gay men would it appeal to? Maybe it's not about them being gay. I don't know. Is it just a weird coincidence?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I don't think it is a weird coincidence. I think there's quite an odd syndrome here, which we see in some other occupations as well, and it's the way that society sort of views gay men, or homosexual men, if you like, in a very particular way. And so it's like the different kinds of gay men go into different kinds of jobs. And the ones that are most obviously gay go into the occupations that we tend to associate with gay men. So, the theatre and design and those kind of things. And I think DEI is kind of coming up on the inside of that as well. I think when you look at men as a whole and divide them into straight and gay, there's obviously the massive difference between straight and gay men, is the obvious thing. But in a lot of ways, there aren't a lot of other differences. I think there's a lot more in common between straight and gay men than we think. And I think that kind of, it comes out not so much as alpha male kind of shouting, browbeating behaviour, but that kind of male dominant behaviour comes out in some gay men, and they kind of channel it in a slightly different way, because obviously they're not kind of throwing their weight around in a macho, I must impress the ladies way. They're kind of throwing it around in a slightly different way. So I think what happens is that certain kind of gay man with that kind of personality is drawn to these kind of roles where they can become a sort of little big man, but they have a little empire of their own. And I think that's what's happening here, that they kind of set up a self-important little world where they can influence people, and they think they're the hero of their story. They think they're great. They think this is really positive and uncomplicated and straightforward, so that they push out their quite male personality traits in that way. I think that's what we're seeing in DEI, and I think it's quite attractive to those kind of gay men, because it does have a lot of soft power to it. You only need one or two people in an organisation to turn it, as it were, onto some quite extreme pathways, as we've seen with genderism over the last 10, 15 years. And I think that's kind of what's happened in some of these organisations, that these men have come in and they're quite forthright, and they don't tolerate or brook any kind of dissent. So somebody raises a question, it's like, what are you talking about, you bigot?
Okay, I just want to give you a little bit more of a flavour of what I'm seeing going on with some of these guys and what is being reported to me as well. People are sending me a lot of DMs. I don't know if that's a surprise to you, probably not.
No, I've had quite a few, yeah.
There's a lot of resentment out there, a lot of people keeping quiet. So I guess for HR professionals, it's worth thinking about all the people who aren't speaking up, because I think they are there and we can't ignore these people. And if you're ignoring them, doesn't mean that they're not talking about you behind your back, because they certainly are. So the sort of stories I'm hearing is about men generally dominating conversations about all sorts of things, but generally just kind of hogging the mic and being the loudest voice, being very dismissive of platforms that are popular with women. So there's a kind of mum's net eye roll, there's a Daily Mail eye roll. And I guess even if you're not talking about women specifically, those sorts of platforms have become almost like synonyms for, like, you know, places that women hang out, kind of thing. Those sorts of women that we don't really like, the mums, the gender critical people, you know, anybody who's, you know, maybe centrist or centre right. You know, it's the sort of, and there's the sort of, I think there's a bit of ageism wrapped up in that as well. And there's a particular disdain for outspoken women, you know, but only the ones who've got the views that are unfashionable. So J.K. Rowling and Kemi Badenoch. So those sorts of views are labelled as hate or far right, and they are ideas that are considered sort of pretty much too toxic to be worth hearing, let alone even engaging with. So you'll see people deleting, you know, posts where somebody challenges them, saying, you know, I delete hate from my timeline. And it just seems like we're just calling anything we don't like, we're just calling it hate. It's this massive, you know, it seems to be a disproportionate reaction to what a reason, you know, there might not be points that you want to hear or that you agree with, but that, you know, these are legitimate views. Then lots of these men do seem to be very thin-skinned and get very angry very quickly when they're challenged. However they're challenged, doesn't matter how polite you are. The instinct on LinkedIn is to block people under the pretext of protecting themselves and their others from this perceived harm. There's a kind of protector role that I see coming in. They often weaponize their own lived experience. So they will use the fact that they were bullied at school, for example, as a way to silence debate, because they understand the perceived victim's viewpoint in this scenario or any scenario. And therefore, anybody challenging that is definitely is by default has to take that bully role, because it's the only role that's left. There is this ageism, I think, against older women and mothers who don't share their views. There's a lot of siding with younger women in the organisation. So, for example, there's lots of talk about menstruation in the workplace. I don't want to talk about this with you any more than you want to talk about it with me, Gareth, don't worry. But there's lots of different approaches to it, and we're being told that the answer to this is to kind of smash taboos, you know, around periods and stuff at work. Loads of women don't want to do this and favour the kind of privacy dignity route. But these men tend to side with the younger women, who are much more likely to think that the answer to this is for us all to talk about periods in mixed groups with our colleagues. And a lot of older women going, hang on a minute, there are reasons why that's actually not such a great idea, but we're kind of shouted down as being like the dinosaurs, you know, and, you know, not helping to kind of progress society in the way that they would want us to do. There's also a noticeable special flavour of misogyny for white women, with this label of Karens. White, spelled W-Y-T, women are told to check their privilege if they question whether it's right to look at everything through a sort of hyper-racialized lens. That often comes back to bite them. You see that a lot on LinkedIn at the moment. And there's also the co-opting of history by gay men in these roles. So the Stonewall Riot, Section 28, are kind of weaponized and used to push their own views when other views are perfectly legitimate. So there's kind of a lot of kind of bad behaviour going on there. Do you recognise that none of this seems to be shocking you, Gareth?
Not at all. No, it's all very, very familiar. Yeah, I mean, it's just all there, really.
Is this men or is this gay men?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that it's coming in this way from gay men because of the current political situation. In another kind of political situation, it might be different, I think. But I think what's happened is you've got a time when, you know, there's a general feeling of wanting to be inclusive and wanting people to feel comfortable at work, and we all agree that's a really good idea, you know, that because that's what the whole point of HR is. I think that's my layman's understanding of it.
Well, there's a whole question about we thought we were supposed to be increasing productivity for the organisation we're running, but there's been mission creep, and it's become about making workplaces a lovely place to work, and those are two quite different things.
That's true. They are.
An identity crisis at the moment, which is how. So I'm afraid you find us at a state of you know, a little bit of distress ourselves. So it's a good question.
Yeah, I think actually then that it would be coming out in a different way, and it might not be led by gay men, it might be straight men that were doing it, if it was more about productivity in the workplace, if as the original idea of HR. I think this mission creep of the inclusivity and the social role and the social element, all those kind of things, has kind of drawn this kind of gay man towards it, because it is a conduit, a place where they can exercise power, while feeling fantastic and being applauded, and everyone's going to love them, and it's all going to be marvelous. And we're going to put up posters everywhere, and we're going to throw some drinks. There's going to be a glitter gun in the corner. We're all going to wear rainbow face stripes, all that kind of thing. So that is drawing this kind of gay man towards that role. But yeah, all of those things sound very familiar to me. I think it's coming out in HR now. I mean, I've been around for quite a long time. In the 1980s, which is a very different time, there were gay men like this in what was the gay rights movement. They're always sort of around. It's a very particular kind of guy. And you see them crop up in different situations as the years go on and society changes. And this, I feel, is where they're kind of settled at the moment.
Interesting.
Like you said, that very swift to condemn attitude, that any kind of rejection is met with an eye roll, any kind of something coming from an area that isn't approved by them gets short shrift, and they try and shut it down immediately. They block, or they do all that stuff about, oh, I'm not putting up with hate. And as you said, you can be as polite as possible. It's almost worse. I've noticed that when you address these people in a tone of, try and be as genuine and to speak in as good a faith and manner as possible, that tends to enrage them even more, I find. Because they start immediately leaping to, what are you covering up? Or I know what you're getting towards, and that kind of thing. Whereas if you actually just say, I think this is rubbish, you're almost on a better platform with them, because you're right there.
Yeah.
Whereas if you give them a bit of leeway to roll their eyes, tut, accuse you of being a Nazi or whatever.
This is when you ask a question and they say, just asking questions, in quotes, is like, that's the, and then, you mention something and everything's a dog whistle. And
oh, yeah.
I'm going to just mention a couple of examples. So there was one in July 2024, which was with reference to Kemi Badenoch's views on the clash between women's rights and what David Tennant would call trans rights. Tennant said that he wished Badenoch, in quotes, didn't exist and would, quotes, shut up. And then she then retaliated. It all became a bit unpleasant. So that was July last year. Without getting into that issue itself, I was quite shocked by some of the responses that we saw on LinkedIn. So there's a chap called Mark Lomas, who's head of culture at Lloyd's of London. I'm going to use his name. It's all public. It's out there. He posted it. He said, our communities will continue to chart an increasingly successful path and have no need of opportunity.
That was my eye roll, sorry.
and have no need of opportunistic hypocrites like her. This is head of culture at Lloyd's of London Insurance Market. Then there was a chap called Arvind Kaushal, who's head of DEI at Milton Keynes College Group, which is quite big. It's not just a little college. He said, I think someone, meaning Badenoch, needs to look up the words bigot and bully and then find a mirror. And then there's a chap called Raj Tulsiani, who's the CEO at Green Park, which is an employment consultancy specialising in senior level recruitment of diverse candidates. So he's a kind of headhunter for people from diverse backgrounds. He's very well known as well. He said, it's the adversarial polarisation that pulls DEI into the slow lane. Some people just need to get over themselves. No two people can see the world in exactly the same way. So moving from my identity politics is better than your identity politics would be awesome. Now that's a little bit more moderate, but he's not saying, okay, I don't agree with Kemi, but she's got a right to make her points. There was a lack of, you might think none of those quotes are particularly damning in themselves, but there was such a lack of you know, what I would expect to see as leadership from any of these guys, which is, hang on a minute, I know that, you know, we don't love her views or whatever, or, you know, some people, they shouldn't even be saying that, in my opinion. They're
No,
supposed
they
to be
shouldn't.
neutral. I think they should be neutral, these guys. But anyway, even if they're going to make the point that they didn't love that, I just felt like that language is wrong. And given that David Tennant seemed to be saying that Badenoch shouldn't exist and should shut up, which is telling women not to speak, I would expect to see from a head of DEI or anybody in any kind of leadership role, I would expect to see a little bit more support for women, any women. But it seems like the support for women is conditional on whether or not they agree with what she's saying. Is that a thing?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, as far as I can see, that's exactly what happens. And it's the same with the fact that she's a black woman as well, you know. Normally, any white celebrity telling a black woman to shut up, I wish you didn't exist, would be a disaster. You know, that person's career would be kind of over. But because it's about this issue, and because she's a conservative, it's all those kind of normal protections, social protections, just casual, you know, not written down protections, but manners just disappear because it was this issue and because she's a conservative. And it was very telling, I think, and those comments are very telling because, as you say, this is a contentious issue and a contested issue. It's not settled, it's a live political issue that's being discussed, and it's not even, you know, off limits anymore in Parliament, you know, and not, it's not actually particularly allied to particular political parties in Parliament. So, for example, you've got like Caroline Nokes and Alicia Kearns in the Tories who are very pro-trans rights and gender and all that stuff. And people in the Labour Party, or previously in the Labour Party, like Rosie Duffield, and some others who have said almost streeting even now, who are going, hold on, you know, let's take the temperature down a bit, and you know, this is a complicated issue with different conflicting views. But it's interesting that those guys that you just quoted were so confident in their roles that they were able to drop that stuff in the middle of that really contested issue. And I mean, that first quote, the reason I rolled my eyes, that was my eye roll, was that our communities line. It's like sort of meaningless guff, you know, that people hide behind this kind of, I hate to say it, but HR boilerplate, you know. When people start talking about these things, it's like they're sort of magic words to stop you thinking. And you know, what communities? What do you mean?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to make a massive difference how polite you are when you challenge these guys. You seem to get quite a similar response. So I had a run-in with a chap called Matt Foster, who's head of DEI Ogilvy. Again, this is all in public domain. He wrote it publicly. I think he was commenting on someone else's post from memory, and I said, "Hi, Matt. I think people who object to trans women being called women in all circumstances do so because they have concerns about possible unintended consequences, for example, around safety in single-sex spaces. Are you saying their concerns are unfounded?" He replies, "My post clearly focuses on the need for the LGBTQ plus community, my community, to practice solidarity. Your question is rather baiting, as it's fomented on the trope that trans women are a danger to cis women. This is my last post on the subject, as I won't engage with it. Safety is a concern for us all, and any comment that starts with, 'Are you saying that?' ... and proceeds to state something I haven't said is a non-starter." So I then responded, "What an odd response to a reasonable question. I hope you'll allow me to try another angle. I see you're head of DEI at Ogilvy. Have you considered how your comments might be read by Ogilvy employees who do not share your beliefs around this issue, including from religious and cultural minorities? To explain, I'm interested in why people in high-profile roles like yours feel so confident expressing your personal/political views on public platforms like this. So conversations like this are helpful in order to deepen my understanding. Thank you in advance." I did do the praying hands at that point.
Yeah.
Anyway, whatever it was, something bugged him because he'd blocked me.
Yeah.
For that. So there's another example, a trainer called John Amaechi, OBE, who's quite well known. He's a he's a sort of DEI kind of guru. Somebody called him a budget DEI Morgan Freeman to me the other day. He's a sort of philosopher. I think he's sort of as why it's sort of giving off a kind of wisdom thing that we're all listening, whatever. Anyway, but he called Maya Forstater, the women's rights campaigner, a TERF, which I think is generally considered a slur, repeatedly, and then blocked her on X. And another lady who works in that area, Audrey Ludwig, who is a very mild-mannered employment law solicitor, posted below something that John posted about women's rights. It was nothing to do with the trans stuff, but Audrey posted, while I appreciate your public expressions of support for various causes like this, I, along with others like Maya Forstater, have found our interactions with you on social media to be somewhat disappointing. When feminist women raise concerns about issues such as single-sex spaces in sports and the harassment, threats, and even assaults they face as a result, it seems these realities aren't met with curiosity or open dialogue. I was blocked and dismissed, I think she means on Twitter, despite being perennially polite and a specialist Equality Act lawyer. It's important to recognise that all protected characteristics deserve equal respect, and policy decisions should take into account the impacts on all protected groups, including females and those who are sex realists. Given your influence and platform, I believe there's a real opportunity to engage in meaningful conversation, especially with those who may hold differing views. Listening deeply to a range of perspectives can create a stronger, more inclusive dialogue. How do you think he responded? It wasn't good.
I dread to think, John.
He said, Audrey, you don't appreciate anything of the sort. You think your saccharine missives fool people. Supporting women and trans women is not incompatible. The danger to all women is cis men. The facts are undeniable. Now, please see lion elsewhere. And then he includes a link to a definition of sea lioning, which I think is when you basically make a lot of noise and, just to get a response from people. I mean, what is that? Is that how we're talking to each other? Is this leadership? We've got people with different views on this very contested and contentious issue. We need to be the professionals that are finding a way through it. This is not it.
No, that is definitely not it. I mean, that's terrible. That's a really bad one. It's quite interesting that he was coming back immediately with all that stuff about our communities and solidarity and these kind of buzzwords that don't actually mean anything. And particularly that thing about, we're all at risk from cis men. It's like, well, there are just men and women. I hate to break it to you. And men commit, an enormous amount of the sexual violence that occurs. And it doesn't matter whether they are identifying as trans or not. That rate doesn't change. If anything, it goes up a bit. But it's just ridiculous to say these things. It's just nonsense.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us, and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. Also, a message for HR professionals who are listening. If you enjoy the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to help shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you get back to the episode. It sounds to me like you're not surprised that what employers would call trans inclusion and what you would call genderism is turning out to be the biggest flashpoint for this.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
What do you think that is about? How do those things all work together?
It's a strange one because this all sort of crept in quite quickly. I mean, in the historical broader context, I think what happened was that the gay rights movement had kind of achieved its aims in the Western world by about 2013-14. There was equal marriage. All kinds of rights were equal. And so they had these large organizations with lots of funding and donors and a whole system set up, an ecosystem of charities and NGOs. And suddenly there was nowhere really to go for them. And so you had genderism, gender identity, the trans lobby, if you like, coming in and kind of taking over at that moment. If you look back, it's almost within a period of about 6 or 7 months. It's quite spooky. It's like 2014, 2015, you get so many organizations changing from being LGBT to LGBTQ+, And I think what happened is it then became, it started seeping into every organisation because it was the thing. So it all just fell like dominoes. And an area like HR, particularly with DEI coming into it, was right pickings. It was exactly in the sweet spot for this to come in and really take over. And again, it sort of attracted that kind of quite uppy gay man that, you know, those emails that you read, those messages, just seemed to me to be a classic example of that personality type. Very thin-skinned, not conciliatory. I think there's also the problem that what was done very cleverly, almost because if one person starts doing it, everybody starts doing it, is that, you know, we talk about cancel culture, but every kind of culture cancels some people. Usually, you know, if you're in a quite a healthy place, it's usually people that have done things that are really, really bad. So when you look at, you know, if people lose their jobs or, you know, are shunned by society nowadays, and, you know, 10, 20 years ago, because they were child molesters, murderers, really quite appalling racists, you know, sort of BNP types, that kind of thing. And I think what the trans lobby did was quite clever in that they sort of used that kind of mechanism to expand what the kind of the people you were targeting could be for that. So by behaving as if that's appalling, you know, you shouldn't say that, I'm blocking you, this is not up for discussion, I'm talking about solidarity with my trans siblings, all that stuff. They sort of put skepticism towards gender in the same category as those things and pushed it out. And then, of course, that starts spreading like wildfire in any organisation. You know, if you see it happen to one person, everyone else is sucked into line. And I think that's what happened more and more. And then, you know, I think the height of it was sort of about 2017, 2018, when it was really dangerous to speak up. You know, you would lose your job, you would lose your livelihood. You know, what happened to Maya Forstater was around then, Alison Bailey, another one. And that was when the sort of hysteria was at its height. So it is a bit less now. But what you were saying about those men responding to that Kemi Badenoch quotes, that's quite recent and that's still there. And although we're seeing a bit of the tide coming in again now, we don't know quite where it will end up, because if these men are still so confident, they've invested so many costs, they've sunk their costs into this stuff. So retreating, when there's all these receipts like the ones you've given today, it's going to be quite difficult for them. Not that I particularly care about them, but it's a problem. It's a problem. How do you walk it back?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a little bit of rewriting history actually from some of them. There was a post by someone called Dr. Sarah Rutherford, who reposted something about pronouns, which she wrote years ago, and she put something in it as a reminder that, you know, a lot of people don't love this stuff for all sorts of reasons. And actually, Mark Lomas, the head of DEI at Lloyd's of London, posted basically something very dismissive about, you know, use them, don't use them, it's no big deal. Almost like, why are you so going on about this? It's the dismissiveness again, as if this was never a big deal. Can't believe you women are still going on about that, you know, and she's older, she's, you know, so it's typically that she's not, you know, she's the sort of woman who's going to stand up for herself.
That response, although it's by a gay man and it's quite sort of eye-rolly, sassy, RuPaul, finger-clicky in its tone, that just sounds, you know, you strip all that away and that's a bloke saying, oh yeah, shut up, you know, who cares?
Yeah.
You know, it's exactly the same. And this is why I think we're sort of fooled sometimes by the supposed differences between gay men and straight men. I think there are a lot more similarities.
I feel like they're getting away with quite a lot at the moment that we wouldn't put up with from straight men. It'd be more obvious what it is. And I think there's something like, it's a sort of like, he can't be sexist, he's gay kind of idea. And they know that they know that women generally think that. And so
yeah.
it's kind of like, is that providing cover for them, do you think?
Absolutely, yes, yeah, I think so completely. I think there's a naivety about gay men and some gay men's attitude towards women, and I think a lot of women don't know about that. And if they do sense it, then they're quite quiet about it. They don't want to talk about it. But I think there is a streak of slightly different misogyny in gay men than there is in straight men, where it exists. And it's harder to point at because it's often done in a more passive aggressive way. And as you say, it's kind of done in a divide and rule way. You know, the younger women who know all the rules about this from their unis or whatever, they've sort of clocked how to fit into this world. The older woman that sat there thinking, what? You know, and what is this? Is immediately seen as something old fashioned, something, oh no, it's the Daily Mail, oh, it's Mumsnet, that kind of thing. When really that's just bog standard sexism, you know. It's just coming from a slightly different place.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word power a few times. You mentioned the soft power. Do you think that's what is attracting these men to this role and these sorts of roles? And is that therefore what we're seeing is what happens when you try and challenge somebody who's in a position that they know is powerful, and then they're not going to give it up? Is that what this is about?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is an attraction. I mean, we all want influence. We all want, you know, to have an impact in some way. But I think these kind of roles, which seem to involve, in my experience, I don't know if it's yours, they do seem to involve a lot of shindigs, a lot of occasions, lots of glitzy awards. Yeah. There seems to be a hell of a lot of awards involved.
A lot of awards. Yes.
I think that is acting like honey to a bee. For a certain kind of gay man that loves nothing better than
yeah.
You know.
Do you think they? I don't think they think they are. I think they think that they are in that position of power for good reason. They have this lived experience, and I think they are trying to. I think they're now switching into this sort of protector role, and something about it feels a little bit like quite often when you hear them speaking at like speaker events and panels and webinars and things, they spend we spend quite a lot of time talking about people's own personal experiences before we actually get on to talking about whatever we're meant to be talking about. It's a good 10 or 15 minutes talking about other people's stuff, and quite often what comes up is, you know, I was bullied at school, or I was adopted, or I'm, you know, the child of a, you know, single mother, or there's always some sort of stuff there. And I this is the first, when I started to get this sort of response from them, was the first time I started to challenge this idea that some of the DEI agenda is political, because I think the way that people are behaving and the way these men are behaving is so immediate and is so instinctive. I think it's personal. I think a lot of DEI is much more personal than people realize. I think it's deeply personal.
So almost therapeutic in a way, yeah?
Yeah.
Almost therapeutic.
A lot of people are going around, with it's sort of open wounds, and it's using their role in some way as some kind of therapist. Listen, I'm not a therapist, what do I know? But it just seems like there's something very strange about what's going on here, which is it feels very unprofessional. I think that's why I'm recognizing it. I'm just thinking, this is not how people behave at work. This is not how how grown-ups behave in public on LinkedIn to their peers. Like this is it feels to me like little boys who, you know, had a tough time at school, didn't get the help that they needed and the support, didn't get any therapy in their 20s when they should have had it, and now they're taking it out on us in their 40s. That's how it feels to me. Someone else said to me, DEI is full of people that got picked last for sports, which is pretty damning. But if you look at it through that sort of lens, I think there's some truth in the idea that there's a lot of people with a lot of their own personal wounds that are going around here. And I think some of what we're seeing is them acting out and trying to switch from that role of being the bullied to the protector. I don't think they see themselves as bullies. They see me as the bully, and anyone who challenges them. I challenge them on, I don't think you're doing a great job because you haven't got any balance here. Because I try and keep my own personal views out of this. People might be able to tell what those might be. But my view is, in your role as an employer, you're supposed to be aware that people have differing views on all sorts of things, including this trans and gender stuff, but loads of things. And you're supposed to be the person that can hold that balance. And if I see people behaving in a way that is the opposite of that, I generally challenge them on it. But but in doing that, I am the bully. I have suddenly become the bully. But you said to me when we first met, do you remember? I said to you, "Am I the bully?" And you said it's even worse than that. I said, am I the person that bullied them at school? And you said it's even worse than that. You're the girl that went out with the boy that they fancied at school.
Yeah. I think this is
which
this
may
is
be
what
one
I
of the darkest things anyone's ever said to me. Not that I fancied when I was at school, actually, but why let details get in the way of these things?
Yeah.
But is there something?
No,
is there something about?
There is.
What is that?
It's
not with any of these specific. Listen, I don't want to talk about these particular.
Sure.
Leave all the examples that we've named to one side as a phenomenon, just because I think it's interesting.
It is. In the book, I describe it as like one of the dark secrets of the gayness of the gay world, and there is. I've definitely observed it over the years. I mean, there's a kind of sexual jealousy for women. Of women, so it's kind of the bloke I really fancy is going out with her, or that kind of thing, and particularly that kind of stuff bubbles around in boys' early teens, mid-teens years, and I think that sort of gets carried along a lot into later life. I mean, so many of the films and TV that gay men make are all about those years. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's like they're kind of almost like rewrites of what should have happened. It always seems to me it's like, they're all about like, really handsome schoolboys falling in love with each other. All that sort of Call Me By Your Name and Heartstopper and bits of Queer as Folk and things like that. Beautiful Thing was another one. There are hundreds of these things, and they all seem particularly fixated about sort of early to mid adolescence and sexual frustration being turned on its head, and I think that can carry over into later life. I've been in certain situations where, drink has been taken and tongues have loosened as the evening wore on, and I've heard gay men being quite remarkably misogynistic along those lines. Not all, obviously, but some, enough. And I think that obviously male and female sexualities are quite different. And, the promiscuity of gay men is legendarily and accurately off the charts. It puts rabbits to shame, and so there is an element of that because, I remember sort of being 16, 17 and just sort of thinking, oh my God, she's turned down a date with so-and-so. Oh my God, I'd go out with them all. But because the considerations are totally different, But I think I would have hoped that as things became more open and more discussed as time went on, that would have died away by now a bit. But it still seems to be there. I sort of get a sort of hint of a snippiness from this particular kind of gay man,
It's making me think, what on earth is any of this doing in the workplace?
Yeah.
This is people's own stuff. This is people's own childhood stuff. This is their own adolescent stuff. It's their own stuff about their sexuality.
Yeah. The other thing we have to bear in mind here is that people often use that stuff to justify their behaviour. That is the way that bad people can exploit other people's good natures. So I think we have to be slightly careful of that, because so all that stuff you're saying about them unburdening themselves, almost like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, without the alcoholicness.
Yes, that's basically all those DEI webinars. It's so personal. It's deep stuff. It's abuse. It's all sorts of problems people have had. It's like
that. Yeah, that's sort of almost like cult behaviour. That kind of confess and be absolved. That's kind of something that religion would have done. And in a much more, neutral environment, really. It's sort of affirming people
once you've told everyone that, they can't challenge you because you've just
exactly,
and you make yourself unchallengeable. Yeah,
it's a ticket, isn't it? It's like a pass. which is a horrible way to look at it. But this is how this kind of stuff operates. It's like, it's dark, like you say. Yeah.
Yeah, some of it. Yeah. So thinking about the possible impact on their role as head of DEI, particularly, I guess I'm thinking about the in-house guys here. I've just made a little list of things which I've thought of. So I think they're creating a monoculture in their team and replicating that across the organization where they can, which I think is creating a sort of groupthink and which sends a message that some employees have the right views and some people have the wrong views. I think that's probably creating a legal risk.
Huge legal risk.
Tribunal.
Yeah,
because you're creating an environment that could be seen as hostile by someone else's legal team, and that doesn't put your organisation in a good light. It's a bad start to a legal case. So your supposedly inclusive culture actually has very strict rules within it, and only the right questions are welcome and challenges viewed as sort of harm. I think there's disproportionate time and spent on LGBT. Despite only, as far as I can see, pretty flimsy data showing that this is a group that needs this level of support. There's a lot on race as well and neurodiversity, but it's noticeably disproportionate on LGBT. And I guess Pride is the biggest example of that. I mean, that seems to go on for it used to be a day and then it was a week and now it seems to be sort of 6 weeks. And actually it tends to bleed into Disability Awareness Month, which is the following month in July. People are still saying Happy Pride the first and second week in July. And I'm thinking, it's time to clear the stage. Like, that's it. We've done it for a month. But even a month is too long. Whereas International Women's Day counts
exactly.
Day.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying there's nothing that needs to be done on LGBT. But it feels very disproportionate. So there's certain groups and issues which seem to be neglected by these guys, I think. I hear very little discussion about disability, except neurodiversity, which is kind of a bit sort of new, so that's kind of exciting. But, sort of boring old disability, like...
You're right, you don't hear anything about that, do you? It's not,
disability is gone. And also social mobility, class stuff, which again keeps coming up as actually being the only kind of diversity that probably is good for your business, actually, when you look at the numbers, is social mobility and class stuff. So that seems to be, that's not very fashionable either. So that doesn't really get any attention either. I think mundane issues impacting women are ignored. I saw a post today from Jolie Brearley from the pressure group Pregnant Then Screwed, talking about pregnancy and motherhood discrimination. So women being pushed out of their jobs at that point in their lives. I don't think I've ever heard any of these guys talk about anything like that. I mean, I guess it's that kind of, is there a bit of an ick factor about women's bodies and that kind of
I'm
thing?
sure. Yeah.
And it's so boring.
You can use you as an incubator, but that's it. Really.
Oh, okay. Right.
We'll pay you a few thousand to use your womb.
Yeah, I mean, some of these issues are under discussed, within DEI generally, and there are plenty of female heads of DEI who also aren't talking about this stuff. But I can see these guys are not likely to start talking about pregnancy discrimination anytime soon. They seem to be incredibly sure of themselves. They're so sure of themselves, in fact, that there's a failure to recalibrate. So I would say things like the CAS review, which was effectively turned out to be what turned into a kind of ban on puberty blockers within the UK, challenging the way that we were looking at what I think we were calling gender affirming care. That was a huge story. That was a huge change. Yes. There's no kind of recalibration around that. There was no mention of it. Also, things like, Trump winning the election in America. Again, no recalibration of, something big is happening here. What, there's a mood shift, there's a vibe shift. What, they're just unable to reflect, to notice that there's something going on, to reflect and to course correct and change their approach to be a bit more inclusive and of people whose views that they don't agree with. You also saw the same thing around the riots in the summer. There's still very little talk about Jewish communities as well. I hardly ever hear anyone talking about Jewish communities. So there's a sort of like, they've decided who the right people are and they're going to stick with that. And they're not, there seems to be no ability to take in any new information after a certain point. That's it. Decided review and that's it. Again, I don't know why in this, actually heads of DEI, as discussed with the brilliant HR director Neil Morrison at Severn Trent, they should actually be really sensible and a little bit dull. And what
Yeah.
happened was around 2020, 2021, a lot of organizations kind of panicked. And what they did was they ended up hiring people with very big opinions, very loud voices, who were very good at conferences and representing this organization they were moving into. What's actually happened is you've got a bunch of people who cannot really listen, reflect, hold balance, engage with people that they don't agree with, hold their own opinion back, keep their own thoughts out of it. So you've kind of got the wrong people. I think that's why they're finding it so difficult to recalibrate now. And I've been saying for 2 years, DEI is on the wrong path. No recalibration at all. There's also, I think there's a failure to acknowledge or consult women as an impacted group, particularly around things like trans policies, around bathrooms and things like that.
Yeah.
So sort of safety concerns are completely dismissed, and privacy and dignity is not even acknowledged at all. There's sort of this hate and this prejudice. I was thinking with the Darlington nurses case, and I don't know about the Sandy Peggy case up in Scotland, whether there's any. I mean, I haven't followed it closely enough to be totally honest about whether there are any men involved in that. But it seems like women were not properly consulted, certainly, and I don't know whether there were any men that played a role in that.
Well, apart from the men, yeah. No, I mean, as far as I can tell, it all sort of went up the chain of command, and everyone kind of passed it around like a hot potato, and it was kind of fudged, and people just didn't know what the law actually said. But I think, hopefully, that the recalibration will have to happen because there are more and more legal cases coming up. And surely you would hope that this would start to get into the minds of, if not the people in DEI, but in the minds of execs on companies that are looking at their legal losses and thinking, hold on.
I think that's exactly what's happening. It's now going above these guys who are then thinking, wait, what has our DEI guy been doing? How did we get into this mess? How has this happened? So you're right. It's becoming very clear the people who are supposed to be, the people who they trusted to get this stuff right are not getting it right.
Yeah.
But I think generally, it's a symptom of the way that, women who are not on board with gender identity and are not going to be on board with it have generally been sort of considered sort of dinosaurs. There are sort of footnote in that the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development did their first guide anyway, did a guide to trans and non-binary inclusion. And there's a mention of the Maya Forstater case, which, as I'm sure you know, was a really important case in the UK. But it's sort of a sort of footnote, and it's sort of presented as if to say, here's the right way to do all this stuff, which of course is totally pro-inclusion, of people who identify as trans. And then the sort of footnote is like, there are some women who've got a problem with this. You have to sort of acknowledge them and make sure that they don't feel bullied or harassed. But really, and it's sort of presented as like, this is a very small group of people that the law says, but it's kind of done with that eye roll again. And that's not right at all.
Particularly when you look at the opinion polling, the more people find out about genderism, as it were, the more they object. These are not fringe views. This is not a few old women. This is a general mainstream view that there is a problem here. And so it's odd to see these things like that, like what you're discussing there, try and sort of still trying to spin it as like, oh, don't worry about that. They'll die anyway soon. That kind of attitude.
Yeah.
When this is not the case at all.
No, I think that has been the thinking that those old-fashioned ideas are going out because there's this idea this is a direct, this is the successor to gay rights, trans rights, as they would call it, is just the new gay rights. So, we'll all fall into line eventually. We'll all get on board, get on board, grandma kind of thing. And if you don't, then it's fine because you're going to phase yourself out anyway. So again, it's that ageism coming in. And because it's women, a lot of women, for example, are saying, I don't like this trainer that's coming in to do LGBT History Month. Do you know that this person's still pushing puberty blockers when actually they're banned in the UK? Like, that's a reasonable thing to have a problem with, I think. There's a reason why that decision was made. Why have we got people coming in who are still promoting giving what seem to be unsafe drugs to children? Why are they coming into the workplace are they qualified in employment law? Who are these people? I think those are reasonable questions. And it's like, to be told to shut up seems to me to create a risk that those women are going to feel like they're not being heard at all in the workplace. I think one of the things women really want to talk about within DEI as a kind of women's issue is women not being heard. But it's like that's a big issue in itself. Women not feeling they can speak up without being told that they're a dinosaur or a bigot. That's the biggest. I think it's the biggest issue that's happening. So if ever there was a women's rights issue at work, can I just ask you a little bit about some of the sort of self-promotion that I see? A lot of the men who I'm talking about are. I've never seen anything like it, frankly. The external self-promotion and the personal brand, whether they're in in-house DEI roles or whether they're a consultant or an influencer, more than any other group, they seem to love doing external panel events, both in person and online. I don't know why the organisations they work for consider this to be great value for money, for them to be spending all their time doing this stuff. I guess they were hired to sort of promote the organisation as a forward-thinking employer, but I'm still not quite sure what the return on investment. The number of webinars I see these people doing. I'm like, when are they doing their actual day job? I have no idea. So that's an interesting one. It seems to me that it's another chance to talk about yourself for an hour and your own stuff and push your own agenda. And nobody ever challenges anybody. So it just turns into this big kind of therapy session love-in. I'm assuming that's what appeals about these things, but it's endless. Honestly, it goes on and on and on. And there's never any challenge. There's also this sort of idea of, like, some of the men seem to really enjoy the sort of perks that go with this sort of scene. There's a DEI scene, and the men, again, are very into that kind of glitzy award ceremony, the champagne, there's, meeting the celebs. There'll be like H from Steps or someone will be there. It's sort of sequin jackets and giant glasses. And there's definitely a sort of scene there. And what I'm wondering also is whether some of these friendships, which should be sort of professional relationships, don't look that professional to me, frankly, create blind spots or kind of inappropriate kind of relationships. So, for example, I wonder whether that some of these guys are now mates, and that's why they're bringing in DEI trainers, particularly around gender identity stuff, who actually are just kind of mates of theirs, rather than properly scrutinizing them and saying, is this the right person, or are they just a mate of mine who's finding that the work is drying up? Let's give them a workshop for Pride or LGBT History Month. I think there's a little bit too cozy, some of those friendships, which is all cemented over a glass of champagne on the red carpet at some glitzy endless awards. I've never seen anything like it. What do you think do you think that's part of the appeal? And would it doesn't shock you that that appeals to them? I think they think that's part of the job.
I think it doesn't shock me at all. It's kind of, again, it's about a very particular kind of gay man that, they do turn up at these things, and they do love self-promotion. And I just suddenly thought about someone. I thought, oh my God, right? Who just ticks every single one of those boxes. It's always like, the kind of person that, you look at Twitter in the morning and they posted 25 photos of themselves, slightly different photos of themselves in a photographic studio, probably, that kind of narcissism is rife.
There's no other area of business that has this level of awards dues and constant nominations, constant awards. I mean, it's really noticeable, and it's jarring at the moment because obviously DEI, as anyone knows who's paying attention to this stuff, DEI is in trouble. And so it's particularly jarring to see all this stuff, and we're still having the black tie swanky dinners and the glitzy. And it's like, guys, can we recalibrate? But they can't recalibrate. But I mean, it's like a lot of these things. I think that the wheels will actually have to physically come off for a lot of these things to stop. Do you think they're using it as a way? They're using their role in a way to feel sort of popular and to be like, again, is it going back to the sort of teen years of the prom that I never went to and the?
I think there's an element of that. There could well be, yeah. It's a kind of, I wasn't paid enough attention, so I'm going to get it now. I think there is an element of that. But at the same time, they might just really want attention. They might just be that kind of person, Narcissists are going to narcissize, that's what they live for, that's what they enjoy. And so something like that, which has so many awards and backslapping sessions and photo sessions, is going to be catnip to them.
And I mean, this is all very understandable. I just don't think it's professional. I don't think that's what they were hired to do.
No,
and I'm worried that, why are people that are using their role in this way, if that is what they're doing, it certainly looks that way to me, why are they feeding into company policy? Why are they being seen as, someone said to me that DEI is seen as the conscience of the company, quotes, and I thought, these people are not elected, and they're silencing dissent. This is not a democracy. They're going around telling people what they're supposed to think and say. It's a lot of language policing, which looks like thought policing, a lot of behaviour policing. This is not professional.
Outsourcing our corporate conscience is not a good idea, I don't think.
No.
It's got to be actual executives or people that run companies addressing this themselves. They've got to look at what they're doing.
One of the other places where this is popping up is within the LGBT staff networks or affinity groups or employee resource groups, whatever we're calling them. I spoke to Kate Barker from LGBT Alliance, who said that she felt lesbians were probably underrepresented within these groups now.
Oh, God, yes.
Lots of younger women who saying that they're queer or maybe sort of under that kind of umbrella. I'm assuming that gay men and bisexuals who don't, who are not on board with all the gender identity stuff are also not going to be represented there. So who's kind of left in these groups? And I think the most... probably one of the most famous examples was Network Rail, who at this time last year, there were all sorts of flags for all sorts of sort of minor sexual identities, which they plastered all over this giant pillar in London Bridge Station. It was a very strange spectacle to see. But the chair, lots of women had a problem with it. But the chair of their employee resource group was a chap called Shane Andrews, who was awarded the MBE in the New Year's honours list in 2021 for his work to boost inclusivity. And yet he seemed to play quite a large part in this. He posted at the time, "No time for TERFs," trans exclusionary radical feminists, which I think is generally considered a slur. Not even worth my energy replying / arguing / debating. And then a bunch of historic tweets came out where he was calling the TV presenter Carol Vorderman a bitch and Gabby Logan a bimbo, and there was worse still, but it was kind of along those lines. So, and then in somewhat bitter irony, it emerged that he was on the judges panel at last year's Women in Rail Awards.
Oh, God.
There's a quote here from Heather Binning of the Women's Rights Network, who said at the time, "We are horrified by Mr. Andrews' comments on social media. He clearly has a big problem with women and lesbians in particular. Yet Network Rail gave him a role where he chaired the LGBT employee network. Not only that, but he's a judge of the Women in Rail Awards. How can someone like Andrews be truly inclusive and understand equality if he says such misogynistic, offensive things about women? And if he's saying all this in public, what is he saying behind closed doors in what is already one of the most male-dominated industries?" I mean, it's these are reasonable questions to be asking.
It is interesting because you get the sort of two faces of the same thing.
Yeah, there was quite a lot more around the boxing at the Olympics as well. A chap called Suki Sandhu, who's an OBE, said basically that any criticism of Imran Khalif's win, or even any questions about Imran Khalif's win, were hate and misogyny against Imran Khalif, and transphobia and racial biases. So all of that is kind of weaponized and kind of thrown out. And this is someone who, Suki Sandhu is quite well known. Again, doesn't seem to be capable of doing any kind of balance here. So for me, it's not sustainable for these guys to be doing these roles. I don't know how they're still making a living. People clearly have some confidence in them, but I don't know how many people, and I don't know for how long.
I wonder if they're scared now as well, that it's like, well, because you let somebody with a sort of grievance and that kind of prickly attitude towards everything into your organisation, it's quite difficult to then dislodge them, because they will start hurling and stuff. They will start weeing back into the tent, as it were.
They're going to go quietly, that's for sure.
That's going to be the problem. They could be a complete bomb, and how on earth do you get the bomb out of the door again?
Yeah. There's one group which I don't think we've got time to talk about today. I'll talk about. I think they need a whole other episode, which is the male allies, who are quite often. These are quite often straight guys who. There's some. I mean, I don't know what they think they're doing, but a lot of these people are doing some very strange stuff, and that comes across as misogynistic. I think they think. Well, some women love this stuff. It's quite a binary split between women that love this stuff and women that don't love this stuff. Women that don't love this stuff saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? This is not working for me. We get told that we're the dinosaurs because we don't think that painting your nails, for example, to challenge gender stereotypes is really doing anything useful.
Yeah.
That's Daniel Fiandecker and Sam Conniff, who do this thing called Hard as Nails, where they paint their nails and in order to start conversations about smashing gender stereotypes or something. And, there's another chap called Jeremy Stockdale who loves talking about menstruation and, encouraging women to open up about their cycle and stuff. People have got different theories about that's going on there. I have no idea what I want to know, frankly. But I don't know what is going. There's some very strange stuff going on. And then there's another guy called Lee Chambers who said actually one of the bonuses of being a male ally is that you get to meet women. So, and women.
I fear that's probably one of the main reasons.
And I was like, this is kind of something's gone terribly wrong here. In wrapping up, have we got any ideas for solutions or any predictions as to where we're seeing these guys going? Are they just going to, if DEI gets phased out, will they just find something else to go and do? What do you see? How do you see this going? And then I don't think they're going to go quietly.
No, I think it will be a gentle removal. I think that, the wider economy is the big question here in a way that's going to influence everything. I think, there are going to have to be a lot of cuts to a lot of things. And I think in a way that's going to be quite handy for CEOs, people higher up the executive ladder to go, well, sadly, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut back the DEI department. I'm afraid we have no alternative. We've been left in this situation. And sadly, that's going to have to end. And I think that might be what happens, that a general economic downturn is used as an excuse to lop off bits of organisations that don't work and just shove people out the door. I think that might well happen, and that might be everyone's way out of it, holding their the dignity intact that
I think the organisations will do what they always do, particularly the private sector. They are incredibly predictable. They will always protect profit when it comes down to it. I actually think a lot of this DEI stuff, which has been so damaging, is actually very out of character for them. Because what they usually do is they do what works for the customers and they do what works for the business. And this is bad, this kind of go work, go broke thing, which is a useful phrase. But I think people generally mean it when thinking about customers, consumers. But actually, one of the things I'm looking at within this podcast is the impact that it has on the organisation from within. So I think it has a detrimental impact on the business from within. And you're spending a lot of money hiring great people. You want your critical thinkers, you want smart people who are going to challenge stuff. And yet those are exactly the people that you're losing through this movement by making them shut up. You're shaming them for asking questions. You're getting rid of your smartest people, the people with morals, the people with questions, the people with integrity. Those are the people you spent a lot of money hiring, and you're losing them and you're being left with a load of nodding dogs. This is not good for businesses.
I mean, I've been waiting for that for a long time. So I hope it's coming. But I mean, the one thing I really couldn't understand, because I worked in television for a very long time, and certainly for, up until about 2012, the viewer was always right. The whole, the attitude was they won't buy that. They won't go for that. They were always first in our minds. Never lecture them, never talk down to them, try to avoid that as much as possible. And suddenly that seemed to flip overnight, with disastrous financial implications for the industry, which is going down anyway because of streaming and that kind of thing. But it needn't have gone this fast. But,
and there's a question about whether it's very easy to blame activists, younger people, more junior people. And there are a lot of those people around, but I think there's also been a massive leadership failure, which is older people. Why were these people allowed to do this much damage to these organisations?
Absolutely, enablers.
You could say, well, they didn't realise how damaging this stuff was until it was too late. But now that we do see how dangerous it is and how bad it is for business, I
Yeah.
think, there's really no excuse for not looking at it again. I'm hoping we're going to see businesses going back to, right, what's the number one thing we're trying to do here? We're trying to sell this or move this forward or change this. But everything else was all kind of icing on the cake. And I think we forgot about the cake.
Yeah, and I think
Too much icing.
I think icing might soon become very optional. I fingers crossed it won't be too bad, but I think we could be looking at some rocky times.
I was thinking, as I'm doing some deep dives into various industries, and I'd love to do TV. So maybe
that'd be great. Yeah.
What's gone wrong in TV? Maybe
I could. I'll chapter and verse for you on that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. Well, we've booked that in. Thank you so much, Gareth. It's been great speaking.
Thanks very much, Tanya.